Hello and welcome to CoronaNomics What Just Happened, brought to you by Econ Films, where we go through yet another week of historic events with you, our live audience. So join the conversation on YouTube in the comments section or on Twitter using the hashtag CoronaNomics. I'm Lizzie Verdon, economics reporter at The Telegraph.
And I'm Ben Chu, economics editor of The Independent. Well, it's been another busy pandemic week with lots of news, a week when statues came down, when it was announced that household bubbles can merge and zoos can open, and the government said it would review whether two should become one. Meters, that is, for social distancing purposes.
Joining us to talk about all that and more is Charlotte Pickles, director of the Reform think tank and former advisor to Ian Duncan Smith when he was the Tory Work and Pensions Secretary. We also have Lord Wood, Twitter's latest guitar sensation, who's also known for being a Labour peer and former advisor to Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and Ed Miliband when he was leader of the opposition. Charlotte, Lord Wood, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hello, nice to be here.
Hi. Well, we've got a nicely balanced couple of guests today, and but we don't want too much musical harmony, despite Stuart's proficiency with the guitar, which we've all been enjoying on Twitter. So let's kick it off, if we can, with moments of the week, as we always do around this time. Charlotte, do you want to start? What's your big moment of the week?
Sure. So this is something that I have been concerned about for a little while, and it feels like we haven't really had a decent debate about. So yesterday we had two reports out, one by the NHS Confederation, which represents NHS providers, and one by the IFS, both saying that the measures that have been taken to protect lives and protect the NHS have had big unintended consequences on the health of people in a non-COVID sense. So the NHS Confederation, one of the things they pointed out is that we're probably going to see waiting lists for operations reach 10 million by the end of the year. So that's more than doubling the waiting lists. And the IFS pointed out that even just in the 2 months where we've got data on mental health, we've seen a substantial, and that's their word, substantial deterioration in people's mental health. And I guess, you know, this comes to the heart of this sort of slightly absurd dichotomy that we've got ourselves into, which is that you can either protect the nation's health or you can protect the economy. But of course, anyone who understands how these things interact understand that a nation needs good health in order to be prosperous and to be competitive. And you know, it's everything linked to the cost of things like mental health to businesses and the economy more broadly, but also things like the ability of people to be in the labour market, which we need, of course. And if they're sick or their lives are shortened because they haven't been able to access care due to the measures we've taken, that's a real problem. And I think we need to have more of a conversation about the trade-offs and understand that easing some of the measures that are in place might actually be good for our health as much as the economy.
Yeah, it's interesting because Rishi Sunak gave a briefing to, I think, the 1922 committee this week, as was reported. And he's one of the ministers who seems to be in the kind of, we need to open up the economy urgently. He seems to be motivated by the fact that he's terrified of a huge cascade of job losses if this isn't done. But would your advice to him to be, don't fixate on the jobs, think about it in the round for all those reasons you've just described?
I think, and can you separate them?
Well, so that's what I was going to say. So yes, I think you do need to think about it in the round. But anyone who has looked at the impact of unemployment on people's health will understand that the two things are very closely linked. So there's a whole wealth of evidence that shows that unemployment for most people, clearly not for absolutely everybody, and there are links to the quality of jobs and all that kind of stuff. But broadly speaking, unemployment is very bad for your mental and physical health. So I think you do need to see it in the round, but I think the scale of job losses, I think it was 3.5 million that they're saying we may see lost by the end of the year. We should be very, very concerned about, not just in terms of the economy, but actually about people's lives, families' lives, health, you know, the ability of the nation to kind of recover in a more sustainable way.
Yeah, and Stewart Wood, I mean, do you see it in the same way as Charlotte was just describing? Do you think getting people back to work is really important for the health of the nation, not just the wealth of the nation, but the health of the nation.
Yeah, I do. I do. I think that we're in an interesting moment when the large numbers, the horrifically large numbers of cases and deaths in COVID have brought spotlight to bear on the costs, the real costs for families around the country of this terrible disease. And I wonder, I think it's really fascinating whether the focus on similarly large numbers of people who are badly affected by lockdown and the long-term consequences for the economy and for mental health, whether the large numbers, when the studies emerge showing how many people are badly affected, whether they will actually drive policy to attack those problems as well in the way we've seen with COVID. I think more longer term, another example is the number of people who die from air pollution in London. We've always known it was a large number, but now we've responded to a large number issue on COVID. I wonder whether that dynamic will continue with other, long-term consequences of bad action elsewhere. So I think I do think they're integrated. I think this is the really difficult time for government now, because in a way lockdown was the easy part. It's absolute, it's blanket. Its costs are well known, they're universal. They're kind of, people take them on board. They understand them. The minute you start lifting lockdown, those effects are your responsibility as the government, bad and good. And I think that's one of the problems the government has got into now, is that the consequences which go in different directions, they have to bear the responsibility for all of those. It's an incredibly difficult challenge for them. Incredibly difficult.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's interesting because Richard Davis was on the show the other week and he was saying economically it's just so bad that, let's say with bailout packages, the government just needs to get the money to firms and they can't really be thinking about conditions in terms of, making the economy greener or anything, even though there are these longer term goals that we should try to integrate maybe. He was saying it's just that extreme that all eyes have to be on getting the economy back up and running. Oh, excuse me, not Corona. Just the immediate things in front of us. Do you think that's fair?
I do. Ian Duncan Smith, Charlotte's old boss, was talking about how we shouldn't. It sort of took me aback to hear him say this, given what I heard him say before when I was working with Ed Miliband and Gordon. But saying we mustn't let the deficit and the debt, the eye-watering, predictions of what they'll be, get in the way of getting the economy up and running again. Ian Duncan Smith is the hyper Keynesian of the day, but that's the way the orthodoxy. That's where the orthodoxy has shifted. Helicopter money of different sorts, and we can maybe talk about the forms of which it might take. It has to be the order of the day. Particularly, we've seen the last day or two the stock markets get very, very nervous about a second wave. Flickers in Florida and elsewhere. And, we could be looking at a prognosis even worse than the OECD's been talking about in the last couple of days. So I do think it's a matter of getting money into people's pockets and getting shovel-ready projects underway as soon as possible, definitely.
Yeah,
I do think
we're going to come on to that. Sorry, go ahead.
I do think, though, that there is a real opportunity here for us still to be a little bit strategic. So I 100% agree. I think this is, and I probably would be perhaps not quite the same degree as my old boss, but I certainly would be on the kind of sound money, fiscal responsibility sort of end of the spectrum. But I agree, this is not a time to be thinking about deficits and debts, and we will have to think about that in due course. But I don't think we should just be saying, it's that classic, isn't it? Kind of, how do you use a crisis to actually deliver some type of good? And I think thinking about sectors of the future, social infrastructure, thinking about kind of, the sort of the welfare safety net actually, and how you get money through options that are going to drive the sort of outcomes that we actually do want to see in the future. And I think there is an opportunity to do that, and we shouldn't miss it.
Right. Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about that. But Stewart, before that, you mentioned this is the hard bit of politics. Lockdown, in a sense, was the easier bit. Now comes the hard bit. Could you give us your moment of the week, please?
Yeah, so my moment of the week was, two moments on Wednesday, really, involving Boris Johnson. The first was Prime Minister's questions, when, for I guess the second week running, he displayed a lot of irritation when Keir Starmer asked him about international comparisons, and particularly about the UK's relatively very high death rate and case rate on COVID. And Boris Johnson replied, as he often does, with a pretty adamant, this is not the time for international comparisons, they don't make sense. Fast forward 5 hours, he was at a press conference making very, very significant international comparisons on the issue of school opening to show that England, I should say, was not out of line with European countries. And I think this just shows one of the problems that the government has, any government would have, and at the moment this government has, which is where the evidence suggests they're doing relatively poorly, they want to say this is not the time for comparisons. When they want to justify something in terms of it being sensible, they're very happy to resort to international comparisons. That's going to catch up with the government at some point, I think. And Wednesday was a microcosm, I think, of this problem. How you cite other countries, how you pray them in aid in ways that don't leave you exposed to significant problems when other people do it against you. It's just one of the many sort of, as lockdown lifts, normal politics creeps in under the door again, right? And normal politics, the rules of it are starting to reestablish themselves a little bit again, I think.
Yeah. Well, actually, let's see if we can watch that clip from PMQs earlier this week that you mentioned, Stewart.
The UK has been going through an unprecedented, once-in-a-century epidemic, and he seeks to make comparisons with other countries, which I'm advised are premature, because the correct and final way of making these comparisons will be when we have all the excess death totals for all the relevant countries.
Right, Stewart.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I don't want to be I am the Telegraph journalist here, but not to be too stereotypical, not to defend Boris Johnson, but in terms of these international comparisons, isn't it to do with the data? It's true, isn't it? Because actually sometimes it's just not an accurate thing to do when the data includes different sets of people, different types of numbers, or actually is it the fault of not making a good enough effort to get all that data correct and comparable?
Yeah, but there's definitely an issue about lack of comparability of data. Excuse me. I mean, we've seen in the last week or so how Spain seems to be doing some really strange things with its data in terms of reporting deaths, and so there's definitely issues around the trends. But if you look at any trend, whether it's case rates, whether you look at death rates, whether you look at excess deaths, which more and more people seem to think is the best way of measuring, admittedly in a slightly crude way. I mean, the UK is not doing very well. There's no doubt about that. Not doing very well at all. And I think that one of the really interesting things is that the government, in a funny way, I hope I'm not sounding too partisan about it, it's not really an anti-conservative point. I really do empathise with the difficulty of this, but the government is essentially pretending to be infallible because they're playing normal politics. They think that any admission that they could have done things better, even with hindsight, 2 or 3 months ago, they think would somehow open the door to them being, considered incredibly weak and incompetent. And I think weirdly the rules of politics are so different in this world. Those governments where you do have leaders who admit mistakes, who admit that it's a matter of judgment, admit that they take action not out of certainty but out of probability. All those more caveated ways of doing politics are rewarded, I think, by voters who understand the complexity. Our government, it seems to me, is still playing normal politics. We did the right decision at the right time in every circumstance. No one believes that. No one believes it. I'm sure they don't believe it either. And I think that way of doing politics, it's really difficult to shift out of it. But I really think that has to give a little bit in order for greater trust between the public and the government to kind of be restored.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, Charlotte? We had a very felt significant moment this week when Neil Ferguson and John Edmonds, two of the top epidemiologists, modelers, said that, if they'd locked down a week earlier, tens of thousands of lives could probably have been saved. What would you be advising a Conservative Party minister you were working for to do when a top scientist says something like that? How would you respond?
I mean, I'd be pretty frustrated for a start, I think. I think it's interesting. I mean, what Neil Ferguson said was absolutely that perhaps if the lockdown had been a week earlier, we would have had half the deaths. But he also went on to sort of place some caveats on that in terms of their understanding of the virus at the time. So I think there is a bit of an element of with hindsight here and with better data and understanding. So I think I'd be a little bit frustrated if I were in number 10 at the moment. It's very easy for someone on the outside to just say, oh, well, you're now responsible for half the deaths. I think, though, if I was, I'm absolutely not going to disagree here. I think the government needs to be more open and more honest. I think they have backed themselves into a bit of a corner from the start, actually, by not having some of the more nuanced conversations that they possibly could have had with the public. I think you can see that in the fact that if you look at how risk averse the UK population is versus some other countries, because we've been fed these very one-dimensional, very singular messages throughout. And I think, it's absolutely correct to say, if you look around the world, you look at the leaders who have who look, I guess, the most impressive now on their domestic and also international stages. It is those who have been able to say, do you know what, we did our best, but perhaps we got some things wrong. And actually, with hindsight, we might have done these things differently. We're going to look at them again. I thought it was, it's interesting at the press conference yesterday, that both Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance were very clear in saying, a core part of science and medicine is learning, right? It's looking at what's coming out on almost a, if not a minute by minute basis, certainly a day by day basis, and trying to iterate as you go along what your policy is. Whereas the government have, I think, been a bit too, we did that, we're doing this, that might happen in the future. And there's no recognition, I think, of the complexity and the ability in this period, as has been said, to perhaps be a bit more honest and a bit more open with the public.
Yeah. Well, so there's obviously been a lot of scrutiny on the government, naturally, but the opposition as well is attracting some scrutiny as well. On that subject, we've got a question from the economist Tony Yates we'd like to put to you.
Hi, this is Tony Yates. My question is this: what do you make of the fact that Keir Starmer has not yet associated Labour with a clearer alternative strategy against COVID? Well, one can make a very good argument, I think, that not only did the government lock down far too late, but it is now releasing the lockdown too early, with no test and trace capacity to substitute for the effects of the lockdown.
Stewart Wood, perhaps you could field that. I mean, do you feel that Starmer could have been a bit more robust than he has been? Should he be turning the screws a bit more on the government?
I think he's slightly changed gear in the last week or two. Actually, I think for the first month or so, he was very much. I mean, he knew that he only had one moment a week when anyone really cared about the Labour leader, and that was in PMQs. And it turns out he, unsurprisingly for someone who used to be the head of public prosecutions, he's really good at that cross-examining thing in PMQs. And Boris Johnson it was difficult for him. But he did it very much, as Tony's question suggests, he did it very much in a, I put it to you, Exhibit A, that you said this, but what about this? It didn't really have a kind of alternative in mind. I think he's been, firstly, a lot more aggressive in the last couple of weeks. I think he sensed that the public mood has allowed him to be a little bit more aggressive on issues like schools, on issues like test and trace, PPE as well. But I think Tony's got a point that I think any opposition leader, even in normal times, faces a choice between how much you emphasise the kind of day-to-day criticism of what the government actually does and how much you say there's an alternative way of doing things. Why aren't you listening to us about following 10 points that you could be doing instead? And Keir, I think, has gone from a little bit from the first towards the second, but he's still very much, I think, looking to call them to account for what they do by way of their headline announcements. And I think the really interesting moment for Keir Starmer is going to be, when does he see the beverage moment coming? When does he see the moment when people are looking to build a different kind of country? We're not out of the crisis yet in a way that enables people to focus on that question of, as some people put it, how do we build better? How do we create a different kind of country in the next few years that learns the lessons from the COVID crisis and maybe other lessons from before? Now, that spotting when that moment comes, both for the Prime Minister and for Keir Starmer, actually, is going to be really important. And I think that's when Keir Starmer can say, this is the kind of country that we should now be thinking of building, and put, as Tony says, a different agenda forward. I think when it comes to managing the crisis, though, I think Keir Starmer's approach is probably the right one at the moment.
What do you think, Charlotte?
I think it's interesting that the question was so confident in thinking what the right answer was, and there is definitely disagreement in the science community, amongst policymakers about the easing of the lockdown, which links to my moment of the week earlier around the trade-offs. And it's not as simple as saying we just need to, protect people from COVID and let's therefore keep everything locked down. There is real, genuine damage that we're doing both to health and the economy, and both simultaneously from doing that. So I suppose I slightly take umbrage with the sort of idea that it's just that simple. I also think, we're not in normal times. And in the same way we've just been saying that actually perhaps the government should be a bit more transparent about its own kind of fallibility. I also think it would look pretty odd if the leader of the opposition started coming out playing very hard politics. And I think, you have to recognise that there is a genuine national imperative here. This isn't business as usual. And I think it would be damaging to, in a political sense, in terms of, kind of ratings and approvals and all that sort of stuff, if Keir Starmer came out all guns blazing saying the government's got this completely wrong, not least because you can't say that yet. And we're nowhere close to being able to understand the data and far enough away from the immediate crisis to be able to make that sort of assessment. So I disagree with the questioner. I think Keir Starmer is probably playing it quite well. I think there is a bit of a problem with him, perhaps at times taking a bit too much of a technical lawyerly approach. But I think, broadly speaking, he's got it right.
Now, we've been having a Twitter poll while we've been talking to ask whether Lord Wood should play us out on his guitar. And 75% of viewers say yes. They must all be in Idaho, where your big following is. So we'll see. We'll await the progress of that, and maybe if you want to keep tuning the guitar underneath that, you've got an opportunity.
I'm with the 25% who said no, definitely.
And if you're watching at home and you've got a question, feel free to ask away on the YouTube comments or using hashtag CoronaNomics.
Now, Lizzie, I think you're going to give us your moment of the week now, aren't you?
I am. So I was watching the Treasury Select Committee this week, and along came Torsten Bell, the chief executive of the Resolution Foundation, who we had on the show just this week. Well, not this week, a couple of weeks ago. And he was warning that employment levels could take 7 years to return to pre-crisis levels. So he said that the Office of the OBR's forecast for 9% unemployment was actually optimistic because it was made before the government announced that it was going to phase out the furlough scheme later this year. And KPMG and others have said that there'll be a second wave of unemployment when that phasing out happens. So Torsten Bell calculated that if unemployment falls by 0.7% a year, as it on average does after a crisis, then it's going to take 7 years. But it could be even worse than that, because retail and hospitality, the sectors that usually help to pull an economy out of a crisis, are the ones that are going to be really hard hit this time. So it's a pretty bleak picture. I'm not saying it's a highlight, but it was the moment of the week that stood out for me. Mm-hmm. Now, on the subject of support for workers, we've got a live question from the barber of Econ Films' founder, Bob Denham, a man we can all testify has excellent hair indeed. So, Jay from London, are you there? Jay?
Yes, I am.
Look, hi, before you ask your question, look at this, Jay. Look at the length of this fringe. What's your question? What's your question?
Great. So I have been in the industry employed for at least 20 years. And for this year in January, I decided to become a self-employed. Being as a new self-employed, I didn't qualify for the scheme, for the furlough scheme. So my question is, as a hairdresser, what the government can help new self-employed and in the hair industry.
Stuart, we've heard about people falling through the cracks. It definitely seems like Jay's someone who's kind of been left behind. We talked about iterating as well. Is the government iterating fast enough to make sure that no one's left behind?
Probably not. I mean, I have to say, I applauded Rishi Sunak when he came out with his initial package, and I know that self-employed people like yourself were slightly left between the cracks. To be fair, the Treasury then did respond, and it hasn't been quite adequate, clearly. I think the really interesting moment now is they've now signaled they're going to try and wind down the salary replacement scheme, the furlough scheme, and put more onus on employers. Firstly, that's a challenge for all employers, but I think the question of self-employed raises itself again on this. I think one thing that they should probably be thinking about is one of the things that they introduced were they gave these emergency business loans, and a lot of people. My brother himself runs his own business, and he said, "Well, why would I take a loan out? I have no idea what the business climate's going to be like for the next 2 years. I'd be mad to take a loan out." I think one thing they could be thinking about is doing with business loans what the government has done with student loans, which is promise that they'll write them off after a certain number of years, and also promise to say that only a certain percent of your turnover each year can be paid back in the repayment before the cap kicks in, and then you stop the repayment. So they give protection to give you an incentive to actually take out those loans much more readily. Now, that I think, combined with what will almost inevitably be an extension in some sense of the staff replacement costs and furlough system, I think that may be a way in which you could get both regular employed and self-employed people to benefit much more. But it is a real problem. Some countries, by the way, have been giving loans to self-employed people, but saying the state will take a share of your business in response. I'm not sure whether that will be attractive to many companies. But I think there's time for imagination, not just for a second wave of support, which I suspect will be needed, but also for filling the gaps, as you say, in the self-employed part of the economy.
Jay, out of curiosity and to clarify, how are you coping? Are you on universal credit through this?
That was the only benefit I managed to get. But as I was saying earlier, it's only unqualified to get it, but my partner hasn't. So it's still very tough. It's a very tough situation.
Do you find it adequate?
Yes, it's quite difficult to say in this situation when you maybe expect a little bit more help from somebody, or a little bit more clarity of what we can do next, as you were saying about the loan. We don't know how the business is going to get in the future. So it's very difficult. Exactly. We expect they're going to be very busy, but we don't know how much.
I think Charlotte, you were... Sorry, I was going to say, I think this is... I think the government did a remarkable job of standing up brand new schemes from scratch effectively. But part of the reason they had to do that was because of the nature of our welfare system. And, this is a good example of where if you'd been in, say, Germany or France or Sweden or somewhere like that, if you'd needed to, for a temporary period, move on to welfare support, in those countries, you probably would have got a percentage of your normal earnings, because the system is much more related to what you were putting in. Whereas what we have is just a very low, far too low, basic rate of support for people. So part of the challenge the government's had to deal with is the fact that our welfare system is not built for these moments. And what a lot of people are finding, and many people like yourself who will have paid into the system for an awful long time, you'll have paid your taxes, you would have expected in a few months of need to have been able to rely on an income replacement rate, i.e. an amount of money that actually enables you to get through this period. And I hope this is going to be one of the conversations that's triggered now as a result of it being exposed just how woeful the amount you get in welfare is for most people.
So that's interesting, Charlotte. I mean, would you like to see the replacement rate for you people on welfare in the UK as high as it is in the continental Europe? Because at the moment it's quite a bit lower for single people, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so single people get what, about 78 quid, something like that, on the basic rate, which is very small. If you've been earning anything that's even remotely above the national living wage, you're going to struggle. And I think that it's not as easy as saying, should we just lift the, I mean, I would say this, right? I'm a policy wonk. It's not as easy as saying, should we just lift the basic standard allowance in universal credit? You would have to shift the system. And what we historically had was something which was contributory based, i.e. I put something in, I get something out. And what we've moved to is something which is purely low income related. So if we were going to move to a replacement rate that was closer to some of those countries in Europe, we would also have to be changing the system in terms of what we put in.
Now, Charlotte, I mean, just thinking about, I mean, you advised Ian Duncan Smith. I mean, do you feel that, as you were saying, it sounds like you're saying the time is ripe to make the benefit systems more comprehensive, more generous, more European, actually. Is that what you'd like to see?
I would like to see a system that's fairer, ultimately. And I think we should have a safety net for those people who ultimately have to rely on it. But I do think that for a welfare system to be credible and legitimate, it has to be, you have to feel like if you've paid in, you get something decent out. So whether it's dubbing it very European, because of course Beveridge originally envisaged it as an insurance type scheme, right? So you know, yes, we could have the argument whether it's European or wherever. Actually, we're simply trying to go back to where Beveridge originally envisaged it. But yes, I think this is the moment to look again and ask ourselves whether we really feel like the current model we have is adequate, because it certainly isn't in moments like this.
Jay, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it feels positive to hear that it's something in there for us. You know, as a hairdresser in the industry, we're not going to open yet, but at least it's something to look forward.
Great.
Thank you.
Jay, can I ask you a question quickly? Sorry, I feel like I'm Martin Lewis here on the sort of on a Radio 5 phone-in. But did you take advantage of the £10,000 cash grant, or were you not entitled to that?
No, I don't think I'm entitled to it because I just registered as a self-employed. So I didn't send the tax return, and they haven't got anything to back up. But that's when I come in again. I was employed for more than 20 years. So that's what I'm coming to as well. I started as a self-employed. I took the risk. But for all the time since 98, I'm being employed. So that's what I'm coming to. So all this time I'm being helped, paying the taxes, being in order, getting the benefits. But now, when I come in self-employed, all this happening, so I had no benefits at all.
Well, good luck to you.
And I'm not the only one. And I'm sure I'm not the only one on this industry. As a hairdresser, barber, it's a lot of people going to struggle after all this. We hope don't cut your hair at home. We can do it for you when everything is back to normal.
The other thing that I hear is that some people in your position feel under pressure to get back to work, even though it might not necessarily, for self-employed pregnant women who are hairdressers, they've said to me that they feel under pressure to go back to work because they need the money, which is really worrying, you know? Oh, I think I froze.
Yeah. Yeah, for everyone. I mean, as a particular for someone who's expecting a baby, they're much more risky for them to try to get back to normality. It's not going to be that easy. Or I don't know. We don't know how much it's going to affect coronavirus into the pregnancy, but they straight away they're going to have the baby after, so they won't be able to work.
It was really great to hear from you. Thanks for joining us, Jay.
Pleasure's mine. Anytime.
See you.
Thank you.
Well, if at home you've got a question like Jay, feel free to leave it in our YouTube comments or on Twitter using #CoronaNomics. Now, Ben, what was your moment of the week?
Well, my moment of the week actually came today when Carolyn Fairbairn, to the Director General of the CBI, gave an interview to the BBC, basically saying a no-deal Brexit in January is definitely not okay. And she said something that came from one of her members. She said, just because the house is on fire, referring to the coronavirus crisis, of course, it doesn't make it okay to set fire to the garden shed, which I think is quite a good analogy, really, because there is a lot of talk that's sort of emanating from Downing Street saying, well, this is a big crisis. Is it really going to hurt that much more to have a no-deal Brexit in January? Maybe we should just sort of go for it. Now, I think this is my moment of the week, because I think we're going to be hearing a lot more of this from business. We've actually heard from Nissan already. Hearing from Carolyn today, I think we're going to hear the voice of business raised more and more over the coming weeks and months. I'm not saying the Brexit wars are back in the way that they were last year, but I think it will be returning to as a topic of debate. That's my view, and I think we're hearing some of the murmurations of that starting up again. But I'm very interested to know what you think, Stewart. Is Brexit back? Could it be coming back as a topic?
I think it is coming back. I mean, I think if you're in Northern Ireland, it never went away, which is the area I think is most vulnerable from the uncertainty and the scale of rule changes that will be needed at the end of the year. I think the thing that's bringing it into sharp focus is that, formally speaking, the end of June is the deadline for us to request an extension. The government's been totally adamant it's not going to ask for an extension. It wouldn't even accept one if the EU suggested one. But I think we live in times when normal rules are being suspended left, right, and centre. And I think as the lockdown starts to be lifted and something like normal business is beginning to be resumed, that gives the space for the concerns about the incredibly tight deadline to get all these rule changes in place. Gives it space for that to become a big political issue again. And I mean, the OECD mentioned this week, that it will be crazy to combine the recovery from COVID and the incredible hit to our economy that brings with all the uncertainty that a Brexit transition will bring at the end of the year, not just for jobs, but for trade and for investment. Why would you invest, let alone hire people, given all the massive uncertainty? Now, whatever the government says about the deadline is going to be the deadline, it feels to me like real politics is going to swing much more. I think the really crucial constituency here are Tory backbench MPs who may have no sympathy for extending Brexit, but who may get incredible deluge of complaints and concerns from the same businesses who've been complaining about the COVID measures. I think if they start to buckle, I think that could be a really interesting moment in the late summer, early autumn. And I suspect the EU would put in place some sort of cobbled together extension if it had to. After all, they have to deal with COVID as well. So I think it's all to play for, no matter what the actual deadlines are, to be honest.
It's interesting that Northern Ireland businesses were saying that they didn't want an extension to the transition period because they know that that's so politically impossible. But now they're asking for a 6-month extension of an adjustment period, because they said that they had no capacity to prepare for COVID. So they need that extra time to get ready for all the extra customs checks and all the computer systems and everything. I wonder if you, Charlotte, think that that's a realistic ask of the government. And also, the government seems so concerned about the economy when it comes to getting back to work and stuff. If you're a Northern Ireland business, surely you'd think how inconsistent this was. But the other point that I wanted to ask you is, do you think that this is just a parting shot from Carolyn Fairbairn? She's, Ben's asking, is it the first of many from business? But do you think that this is actually just a one-off?
There's a lot of questions there. I think, Caroline Fairbairn's been pretty outspoken. In fact, the CBI has generally, and I'm not sure it's always done itself too many favours. That said, I do think there is a real issue with preparedness. So, I think it was fair for the government to have said pre-COVID, that a no-deal Brexit could be on the table, and therefore you should be preparing. And I think there was a decent chunk of activity among businesses, which was about preparing for a no-deal Brexit that would have had a economic shock they'd have to have lived through. They have had to use, their kind of, if you like, their reserves or their sort of the measures they had taken in order to prepare for a New Deal Brexit. They've had to use those during coronavirus. So I think we're in a slightly different world in terms of the position of businesses and what government could legitimately argue they should or shouldn't have done with the knowledge that a no Deal Brexit might be coming. I think ultimately this is going to come down to politics, as it has throughout the Brexit debates. And I don't know whether the government will shift, given that it came in on a very get Brexit done platform. And I think, I mean, maybe you're exactly right. And the wriggle room here is by creating a whole new name for something that looks like you're still doing Brexit, but is called something else. And, maybe semantics will come into that, and politicians love a bit of that. But I do think that the government will be cautious about doing anything that looks like they're not delivering on their main manifesto pledge.
I think actually also just to weigh in. I think that's exactly right. I think that if you listen to Michael Gove, we've had him at our committee in the House of Lords a couple of times, and I think if you behind the lines you can hear a new argument as a result of COVID emerging for sticking to the hard line on Brexit, which is we're going to need the massive deregulatory latitude that leaving the EU in a kind of clean way will give us in order to be able to do the things we need to do to respond to COVID. So I think you might hear more and more of that argument from the ultra Brexiteers, as it were, that we need a clean break, because a clean break is going to give us on state aid, on supporting apprenticeships, on fisheries and everything else. It's going to give us the latitude we need. So I think you could get a really interesting contest between the sort of pragmatists and the sort of purists, as it were, on Brexit within the Conservative and the Leave community in the next few months.
Well, on that subject of a clean break and a new economy, we've got a question in from Anthony Ive from Bristol, and it's about automation.
In the 18 months after the global financial crisis in 2008, the grocery market increased automation with self-service checkouts. Which sectors do you think are going to be increasing automation over the next 18 months the quickest?
Now, Stewart, it's a question that sort of goes to a lot of people's insecurities, doesn't it? This question of automation. What do you feel that it is going to be speeding up, and what are the political challenges that are created if it does?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I guess I think the sector that's most affected is politics, because we've just been told in the House of Lords we're having our first remote voting session in the history of the House of Lords on Monday and Tuesday. So we're all learning how to use the app to do it. I think there's a difference between automation and online or remote working. I suspect the latter will be a bigger legacy, as it were, of COVID than automation. But I think actually weirdly, I think that one of the big class differences of lockdown has been that, of course, it's much easier to do remote working and online working if you're in a white collar middle class profession than if you're in a service industry or a delivery or a physical manufacturing job. But I don't know. I think one of the interesting things about automation is there's been this big debate now for a few years about the inevitable trend towards reduction in the amount of labour in the economy and automation and the universal basic income as a possible policy solution. And almost inadvertently, we've had universal basic income experiments as a result of COVID. We've had them in the United States with some really perverse consequences, right? In the United States, people unemployed are getting way more now than they were when they were just normal unemployed in pre-COVID times. And it's really difficult to see how you're going to shift back. Imagine that conversation when the president says, I'm sorry, or the governor says, I'm sorry, but you got to go back to 60% of what you were on during COVID. Now it's normal times again. So in a way, these things have shifted politics on these debates about automation and the policy response much more. I'll be really interested to see whether the sort of the technology heads who've been pushing universal basic income for a while seize on this and say this is when we should be pushing much more for a more thorough solution. So I suspect online working will be a longer legacy, and I think it will probably be much more of a sort of middle class legacy than it will be a cross economy legacy. I could be wrong.
Charlotte,
sorry. I hope we do see more automation. One of the big problems that we have seen over the last decade and longer is the fact that the UK has not invested enough in technology, and that is one of the reasons why we've seen such a productivity lag compared to other countries. And actually, retail is a great example. You go to a lot of shops on the continent, and the little price tickets that tell you how much the thing is, the chocolate bar or the apple or whatever it is you want to buy, are automated, right? in the UK, we still have people who go around and put tickets in and change them every time a price changes. So, I mean, that's a tiny, tiny example, but this is part of why we've got a productivity problem. And actually, the point is not to be scared of automation, because there's loads of kind of low skill, if I can use that phrase, work that could be easily automated. The challenge is how government responds to upskilling workers in order to do the jobs that aren't going to be automated. And the other thing I would just quickly say on sectors, the areas that we're seeing booming, if I can again use that word, during this period, are sectors where we're less likely to see as much automation. So things like care services, and we really need to think about how we properly invest in those people who are doing some of the toughest and lowest paid jobs, because actually there are going to be sectors that continue to grow regardless of what the recovery looks like, because they're critical, and we should be thinking about how we invest in the skills and the wages, quite frankly, of those sectors. So I hope we do see automation, but I hope we also see a similar skills investment and response that goes with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting point, and we've had a lot about the impact about information and inequality, and we've actually had a question from Thomas Pickford come in on that subject. Is the current crisis going to increase inequality even further? What can we do to stop inequality rocketing? Stewart Wood, I mean, that's kind of Labour territory, isn't it? I mean, did Corbyn have it right about how to stop inequality rising?
I guess, I mean, I would say privately, but it's not private because we're live. But I sort of thought that weirdly, Corbyn's passions on inequality didn't quite match his policies on inequality. I thought his passions on a bigger role for the state definitely reflected themselves in the manifesto. On inequality, I sort of wondered where the wealth tax and other kind of policies were that would, make a reality of those commitments. So I'm not sure about that. I think there's no doubt about it that COVID is going to increase inequality. I think of course it's going to. Those systems that have stronger welfare states and have the floor that's higher are going to have less of an effect. We have a weaker floor and it's going to be bigger. There's no doubt about that. And income preservation during the crisis has been greater in the higher income professions. So that's definitely true. And I think Charlotte raised a really interesting point on automation, which is that you would like to see a shift in the way that she suggests, but we have a service-dominated economy, as the OECD has been talking about this week. And I suspect in order to get a short-term recovery of our economy, we're going to have to focus precisely on the least automated parts of it, the more face-to-face, service-oriented bits of our economy, just to get people back to having their heads above water. But there's definitely a long-term, I mean, in a way, this long-term debate about the British disease of productivity and inequality has been just multiplied by a factor of 50 because of the crisis. The question is whether we still remember it 2 years from now as we are slowly emerging from it. Do we care enough about this for it not to be just something we all agree with, whatever our politics, during the worst times, but something we're going to prioritise in our best time? If I'm going to be self-critical, when I worked for Ed Miliband, we wanted to make inequality in a kind of restructuring of our economy the central issue in politics. Actually, one of the reasons we failed was because the central issue in politics wasn't that. It was austerity and how to respond to the crash and the kind of public finance response. And we didn't succeed in replacing that as the central challenge. Weirdly, I think now is a better time for that to become the mainstream issue of politics, probably on the, from the left of the Labour Party to the left of the Conservative Party. You can see how that could become a common agenda, I think. But it's a really interesting question whether people will continue to care about it as growth rates pick up again in maybe 2 or 3 years from now.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, Charlotte, do you see that potential for a common agenda, cross-party, non-partisan tackling of inequality?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was going to sort of gently push back slightly on what was said there, that this would be a kind of on the left agenda, perhaps people more on the right don't talk in the sort of phrase of inequality, but actually I think social justice has been a big issue for quite a long time within the Conservative Party, and not among those that you might categorise in a sort of left-right positioning. I do think this is a really big moment, but actually if you look at what both manifestos had in them back in December, the levelling up agenda was one of the most central planks of what Boris Johnson was talking about. And ultimately, that's one aspect of inequality. It's talking about the regional divides. It's talking about the left behind communities, to use that phrase. And so actually, I think there is quite a big momentum. I think it's really unfortunate that COVID has disrupted what was, I think, quite a focus of Number 10 and the Treasury previously around levelling up. But the flip side of that is exactly what Stuart's saying, which is that COVID has exposed a gazillionfold where we have those injustices, be it around ethnicity, be it around socioeconomics, be it around geography. Think about the communities that are going to have been hardest hit. We know it's low skill. We know it's certain sectors like retail, hospitality, etc. Some of our coastal towns, those northern areas, they're going to have sectors where we've currently got large proportions furloughed. Those sectors aren't going to come back. The furlough scheme isn't matching the lifting of the lockdown measures. And we're probably going to see a big wave of unemployment increases in the very communities that are already still struggling from decades of people not focusing on how you create jobs and prosperity.
It's really interesting. Now, Stewart, have you got your guitar ready? Because we've got the results of our poll. Is the sound cutting out at this moment? Because 75% of our audience would really like to hear you. It's your last chance.
Can I just say that exclamation mark is a leading question on a poll, and I think it invalidates the whole thing as a result.
Oh no, we've broken the British polling rules.
Oh no.
I think the sample might not be necessarily scientific either. But
it's 4 people, it's 75%, it's 3 out of 4 people, that's what I reckon.
Well, maybe next week you can do the intro for us.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll send you something, definitely.
People viewing, definitely check out Stewart Wood's Twitter feed, because he's been posting a song and a guitar piece every day of lockdown, and it's some fantastic stuff if you like Jethro Tull.
Even if you don't, you can just laugh at me, it's fine.
No, seriously, it's been fantastic to see it on Twitter, so do check it out. And that's unfortunately all we've got time for. It's been a great conversation. I particularly like the point that Stewart made about America being the sort of the testing ground for a universal basic income. Who would have thought that,
exactly.
a few months ago? And we didn't get on to bringing down statues, but we've still had a fantastic conversation, covered a lot of territory. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks to Charlotte and Stewart for joining us, and for you for watching and sending in those great questions. Do please keep them coming in, and also any suggestions of things we might cover.
Check out our latest episode on YouTube. It's an interview with Stephen Riker and Cass Sunstein, where we ask whether behavioural science has been a help or a hindrance in fighting the vaccine. That'll be up soon. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at CoronaNomics TV for all our latest updates.
Thanks for watching CoronaNomics. What just happened? Join us next week for more. Goodbye.